So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this event. My name is Abhinay Mutta, as many of you know. I am a research lead at NISA, this wonderful building, this wonderful institute, as many of you know. For those of you who don't know, this is an institute that was set up in 1938 by John Maynard Keynes, one of the founders, architects of the world order. That is still around and but still under threat at the moment in various ways. So warm welcome to all of you, especially those of you from outside NISA to NISA. We have eminent guests here. We have Jon Yates here. Before I introduce Jon briefly, I will say that today's talk actually is, again, as some of you know, is on the subject of reducing violence in general, but in particular against and between young people, women and girls in particular. And indeed, that is a theme of one of the 6 missions of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, called Safer Streets mission. And so it's a particularly important in any way, but in the priority of this government. So it's particular for that reason in particular as well. It's great to have Jon Yates going to talk to us on this theme. Jon is currently the CEO of the Youth Endowment Fund. I won't give you a whole biography of Jon because otherwise I'll eat into his time. Jon started out as a youth worker and did that, and then went into government as well for a little while, and then moved back out into the charity sector. And for the last 3 years or 4 years, you can correct me in a minute, he's been heading this. And of course, I have a connection with this organization indirectly, loosely, since I was part of a commission in 2017 onwards that recommended in 2018, 2019, a public health approach to deal with violence. And I think that, and Jon can comment on that when he talks about gives his presentation, whether that informs the work of the Youth Endowment Fund or otherwise. So, real pleasure to have Jon Yates here. The format, Jon can correct me on this if he's happy with it. We discussed it on email. Jon has a free reign for 40 minutes or so to give his presentation, give his talk on the subject. And then we'll have a 20 minutes or so Q&A session. So start thinking about those hard questions, easy questions that you want to ask Jon, not me. And then by 6:10, 6:15, we'll wrap it up, depending on your interesting questions, and move next door to continue the discussions on a drink, networking reception, as I call it, next door. It's the crafts room now for about 45 minutes for an hour. So plenty of time even there to network amongst each other. And with Jon will be there as well. Hopefully he'll stay back and we can continue the discussion informally next door. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jon. Jon, thank you very much. Welcome.
So let me say very briefly about what the Youth Endowment Fund is, and then I'm going to move off that and talk about how do we reduce violence and what do we know. So just very briefly on the Youth Endowment Fund. So the YEF, the YEF is the UK's largest what works centre. No one knows what that means. I mean, it's basically we're a charity that was given £200 million of taxpayers' money. So you're all taxpayers in some form. So thank you very much indeed. And we exist to try and get really clear about what it is that works to keep particularly children safe from getting involved in violence. And we operate across 7 different sectors, and I'll come back to those sectors in a bit. This is the organisation in a nutshell. What's the vision? The vision is, if you ever pull it off, you should close up shop. That no child should become involved in violence. I wish it was credible that we will ever achieve that vision. We will not, but that is the aim. What's the mission? For me, a mission is, that's great, you've got that vision, but loads of people want that to happen. What's your specific role here? And our specific role is to try and find out what works and then build a movement to put it into practice. It's a bit pointless finding out something if absolutely nothing changes as a result. So that's why we're here. That's why we exist. Before I go into this, let me just start with a child's story. And I should say we're talking about violence, and to some extent I'm talking about violence involving children. The majority of violence is not committed by children. I suspect that's probably just statistically obvious to you. The majority of violence is committed by adults. But if you want to stop violence committed by adults, it probably makes sense to start helping children. But I just make that as a sort of a starting point. I want to focus on a child who's known in the public, at least, as Child C. The most important thing to tell you about Child C is that he was a child. So he was never old enough to vote. He was never old enough to drive. He was never old enough to go and watch a 15 film. He liked playing football. He used to take his uncle's dog, Benji, for walks in the park. He told his friends that when he grew up, he would be an entrepreneur. When he was very little, he convinced his mum in the town that he lived, Nottingham, to buy gloves for homeless men that he'd seen because he was worried that their hands would be cold at night. When the ambulance arrived, Child C was still breathing, but it was too late to save his life. 500 children die every year from accidents, but Child C's death was not an accident. He was hunted down. He was hit head on by a Mercedes, stolen, and used to try and kill him. Lying on the ground, he wasn't helped, he was attacked. Those who killed him had been looking for him, and the pathologist report says that he was stabbed 9 times. Child C's life had been far, far, far from easy. He was 5 years old when his father was sent to prison. He was 6 years old when his father was deported. You could say that as he grew up, he got into the wrong crowd. He was first arrested when he was 13 years old for carrying a knife. He moved to live with his grandmother away from Nottingham into London to try and keep him safe, but ended up sleeping on a couch. He was arrested again just a few months later, but this time in Bournemouth, where police found him in a house preparing drugs to be sold. He was returned home and a few months later was permanently excluded from school. Within a few months, he was dead, caught in a fight between 2 groups of children. I would love to tell you that the story I just told you is unique, but I can't tell you that. But it is rare, but not unique. In every year, roughly 50 children are murdered using a knife or a sharp object. Roughly 500 children end up in hospital because they've been attacked in the same way. But I think that understates the importance of this problem, because those numbers, 50, 500, are in fact the tip of a much larger iceberg. We survey roughly 10,000 children every year, representative sample of children, that give us a picture of why violence matters so much to their lives and why it should matter to us as adults. I told you that 50 children are murdered and 500 children are admitted to hospital. But teenage children, this is on teenage children being polled, 1 in 25 tell us that they've carried a knife at some point in the year prior to us asking them. It doesn't mean they carry it all the time, but they've carried it at some point. 1 in 20 teenage children would describe themselves as being in a gang. Now, the word gang means a lot of different things to different people. We ask children, would you describe yourself as being in a group of people your own age who together commit criminal activity on occasions? 1 in 20 children would describe themselves in that way. 1 in 7 teenage children at some point in the last year perpetrate violence. Some of that is not very serious, though it is probably stuff that would result in me being suspended from my workplace. Roughly 2/3 of those events lead to someone else being injured enough to bleed or to have a permanent, or at least a lasting mark on them. Therefore, unsurprisingly, 1 in 6 teenage children are victims of violence. Mathematically, you won't be surprised to hear that 1 in 4 teenage children in a given year are either victims or perpetrators of some form of violence. Well, what about seeing violence? 1 in 2 teenage children are either seeing or victims of violence in any given year. I think the most important question, though, is what impact does this have on children's lives? You know, what difference does it make to them? 1 in 2 teenage children tell us, and we get pretty much the same result every year, that they've changed their behaviour in some way because they're afraid of violence. And so that includes roughly 1 in 5 children having some sort of mental health concern because of their fear of violence. For example, being unable to sleep. Roughly 1 in 5 children are skipping school because they're afraid of violence, more likely on the way to school than in school. Roughly 1 in 4 teenage children say that they've stayed at home rather than go out because they're afraid of violence. Now, it's up to you whether you think those are serious impediments to a person's life or minor ones. I feel they're pretty serious, not being able to go out, being afraid of going to school. And so when we think about violence, we see an acute, small problem and a very, very wide shadow that it falls. I think as you hear these statistics, and some of them won't be probably new to you, I think there's an obvious reaction. I think the obvious reaction is to feel a bit hopeless and a bit of a sense of, can this problem ever be addressed? Let me suggest that we should be hopeful, because problems do get addressed. It may not feel it very much at the moment, but things often do actually get better in human society. This is the rate of literacy about 200 years ago. About 40%, 4 in 10 adults in the UK could read. 50 years later, it was roughly 6 in 10. 50 years later, it was pretty much everyone, and it's tipped up a little bit since then. If we think about weekly pay, we're obviously in a cost of living crisis, and it feels like we have been for about 15 years. But it was even worse about 200 years ago, when the average weekly pay in today's money, roughly today's money, was about 35, 36 quid. It roughly doubled in 50 years. It roughly doubled again in 50 years. It increased about 50% 50 years later, and then doubled again 50 years after that. That doesn't mean that life is brilliant, but things do change. What about something perhaps more precisely serious, like the maternal death rate? Roughly 200 years ago, 580 women would die out of 100,000 births. But 50 years later, it fell dramatically. 50 years later, it fell even more dramatically, and now we're roughly here. It is still too high, but things do get better. And you may hear this and think, I notice you haven't talked about violence. Well, it's true of violence as well. And actually, we can go back much further when it comes to statistics about violence. We can go back as far as the 14th century. So in 1325, the homicide rate, so how many people die out of 100,000 people, was about 21. By 300 years later, it had gone down by 75%, but I have to get into questions and answers why this might have been. It fell again dramatically in the next 200 years, and it's fallen again since. Things can get better. I think the mistake we must avoid is the idea that we can't do something about this problem. Violence is not inevitable. There are countries on this planet who have a lower level of homicide than we do. We can bring it down. I think that the next reaction, I'm going to take us through 4 reactions in this talk. The first one is nothing can be done. And I think something can be done. The second is, okay, let's go and do something. Okay, so what can we do? Let me give you some examples of things that people can and do. I was talking to a group of school leaders last week about some of the things they do in their schools. These are 3 things that school leaders commonly or relatively commonly do. The first is knife awareness education. So going into schools, running sessions, people often campaign to get more on the curriculum, to talk about knife awareness, to talk about knives, to make sure children understand the dangers of knives. So that's something that schools can do. Here's a second thing that's growing in popularity: trauma-informed training. So short, often half a day, 2 hours of training for frontline professionals in schools, also happens elsewhere, about trauma and the impact of trauma on violence. Here's a third one. This is much more controversial, but police going into schools. So secondary schools in particular often have police coming into their schools and spending time in those schools. So it's clear that people are doing things. And I'll say a bit more in a moment about how many schools are doing that. Here we go, 30% of secondary schools are doing knife awareness education programs, 34% are doing trauma-informed training, roughly 22% having police in schools. So it's common enough to believe it could happen much more. It is a common response. People are doing things. This is a place where people did things. So this is Rahway Prison in New Jersey in the United States. And it's a sort of remarkable place. So there were a group of men who were held in Rahway Prison, and they got to know each other. They described themselves as the Lifer Group. You can probably get a sense of what sort of crimes they may have been committed, as they were obviously on life terms. And those men gathered together and went to see the governor. And they said to the governor of the prison, look, we've messed up. We know we've messed up our life. We would like to do something. We'd like to contribute. We'd like to do something. We'd like to make something better, make some sort of amends. And they said to the governor, what we really want to do is we want to say, we wish someone had said to us when we were young, don't make these mistakes. Give us the chance to pass that message forward. Give us the chance to say to young people, don't make the mistakes that we made. And the governor, being quite a forward-looking sort of progressive sort of person, said, well, great, let's do it. Let's make it happen. And he stepped into the void and he said, great, I'm going to work with local schools and we're going to work out who are the children who need to hear this message, and we'll get that message to children. And the program happened, and the children were interviewed afterwards, and they said what a transformational difference it had made to them. They were children selected because they were concerned that they might be heading down these routes. And they said this has opened up our eyes to what could happen to us. And so the program started to spread. Other people started to hear about it. And they even made a documentary about the program, which won an Oscar. If you look up the 1978 Oscars Best Documentary, it is a film about the Rahway Prison program. And so in an amazing moment of bipartisan effort, hard to believe now, the program spread across Democrat states, across Republican states, until tens of thousands of children were going into prisons to hear this story, to learn how they wouldn't make the same mistake. And again, they were followed up and interviewed and said, this has been transformational to my life. And so someone thought what we should do now is just really do a rigorous follow-up so we can make the case even better. And so they did what's called a randomized control trial. And so for those of you who are like, what are you talking about? Forgive me while I briefly. So you basically would have some children who would go into the prison and some children who would not go into the prison, but they'd randomly select the two groups. So they couldn't suggest there was some difference between them. And they followed up those children's lives to see the impact of them. And sure enough, they proved that the program was having a very significant impact. It was making children 25% more likely to commit crime. The Rahway Prison experiment came from a really good place. It was a desire to do something. And it has a story behind it that, unless you know, and some people would know, it sounds like this is good news. I'm going to tell you this is great, but it wasn't. It was making things worse. And it sends a message, I think, to us that we've got to be slightly careful of the idea that we just do something. And we've got to be slightly careful of the idea that we as adults can just go and do whatever we want to vulnerable children, because as long as we are nice people, we'll make things better. There was a point in the Rahway Prison program in that story before they did the randomized control trial, where there was no evidence one way or the other. If they were really honest, the documentary would say, we don't know. We don't know if this works. Those three interventions I talked about happening in schools, they're at exactly that point before the randomized control happened. There's presently no evidence that these three programs work to keep children safe from violence. I personally think it's quite unlikely that it's making things worse. I personally have a suspicion that these programs are not actually having much of an effect, but all I have is suspicion. So we're part of funding some trials to try and work out the impact. And I know will be more delighted than me if these programs work, in which case let's get them into 100% of schools. But we've got to be careful of the idea of moving from nothing can be done to just do something. This is the General Hospital in Vienna. This photo is rough. This picture, obviously, is roughly from the first half of the 19th century. In the 1840s, this hospital was a remarkable place. It was a leading hospital in teaching medicine. And growing up in Vienna, or living in Vienna in the 1840s, was really a pretty safe place to live, unless you got pregnant. If you got pregnant, and you went to this hospital in Vienna in the 1840s, you had a 1 in 10 chance of not coming out of that hospital alive. You had better odds surviving being sent to the front line in World War I than you did going into that hospital to give birth. That meant that every day, roughly 7 women were dying in that hospital. Roughly every week, over 50 women were dying. Roughly every year, over 2,000 women were dying. It was a completely intolerable situation that absolutely everyone tolerated. Apart from one doctor. There was a doctor called Ignaz Semmelweis who didn't tolerate it at all and became absolutely convinced that something should be done. Now, Semmelweis thought, what we have to do, I don't know, he said, I don't know what the answer is, but we've got to just test a whole load of different things. And so he threw his attention into trying to change everything he could about the hospital. But being a good scientist, he changed things one by one to see what it was that would make the difference. So he changed the diet that the women were eating. He changed the airflow in the hospital. He changed the positions that they gave birth in. He changed the way the laundry was done. He changed everything he could possibly think of, and each time checked whether it made a difference to the death rate. Nothing made a difference until he went away. He got sent to go and teach. He was a teaching doctor to go and teach at a different hospital. And he noticed while he was away, the death rate fell. Now, being a good scientist, he didn't ignore the finding. And he said, okay, what's going on? What's causing this? Obviously, the obvious answer is me, but what's causing it? And he began to work it out. Now, the thing is, he was a teaching doctor. And in 1840, this is 20 years before Pasteur, so we don't know about germ theory. How did they teach people? He was a surgeon most of the time. How do you teach people surgery? You practice. What do you practice on? They practiced on dead bodies. And so the doctors would be trained and practicing on dead bodies, and then a woman would go into labor. And they knew that time was important, so they would rush over to help the woman being given birth, moving all of the germs over to the woman. Semmelweis didn't have the proof that that was what was causing it, but he knew that when he went away, the deaths had fallen. So he said, okay, let's start cleaning everything. We're going to wash our hands properly. We're going to clean all the tools. We're going to clean all the things we're wearing. And he was a very senior doctor, so he just insisted on it. And guess what happened? The death rate fell again. It fell from 1 in 10 women dying to 1 in 100 women dying. Absolutely extraordinary achievement based on a person who was not prepared to accept something and prepared to test and actually work out what's going on. I am absolutely committed not to the idea that trials and tests can tell us everything we need to know. They can't. They can't often tell us why something happens. There's loads of things that work that we haven't tested yet. They can't. There's loads of things they can't tell us. But why on earth, in a country where we spend roughly £90 million a year testing ice cream flavours, would we not spend proper money testing to work out what works to keep children safe? Now, I'm not going to spend ages on this next slide. So you're going to have an experience of just being like, God, there's a lot on that slide. Now they really know what it's saying. But one of the things we produce, or we believe is, look, there's loads of trials that are going on. It should be easy for everybody to try and understand what they said without having to read academic papers. Not because academic papers are always hard to read, but because they need to be thorough. There must be a way to access that information easily and accessibly. I am a fan, and I may split the room a little bit by experience. I'm a fan of Which magazine. I don't know if you've ever used Which magazine. Like if you ever want to buy, I don't know, a Hoover, you might well use Which magazine. And it like gives you a list of all the different options you could buy and the percentage score. And you know behind it is deep research. You don't have to read the research. Now, Which magazine doesn't do what violence reduction method should use. So we do it for them. And what we produce is something called the YEF Toolkit, or the YEF Toolkit, which is just a simple list of all the different ways you could try and reduce violence, and then whether they tend to work or not. This is roughly what it looks like. So you end up with a measure of what is the average impact of violence. Here are all the list of things that you could do. That's going to be populated in a moment, and you're going to be like, too many words. And then how confident are we on the quality of the evidence? When I'm talking to ministers, I tend to say, this is how much I think you should actually believe what I'm telling you. So if the evidence quality is low, don't really believe me. If the evidence quality is high, you should really believe me. What it does is then it breaks it down into some things are high impact, 30% reduction or more. Some things are moderate impact. Some things are low impact, probably not worth spending lots of public money on unless they have other benefits, which most of them do. Some things have no impact. Some things we have absolutely no clear evidence either way. And then there's some things that are actively harmful. And so I mentioned a moment ago the railway prison experiment. There it is, prison awareness programs. We're really confident, 4 magnifying glasses out of 5, Sherlock Holmes fans. We're really confident it's a bad idea. We're also pretty similarly on boot camps. Do not send children to militaristic style boot camps. It's a really bad idea. So what does it tell us? I'm not going to go into it in lots of detail, but it starts to lay out pretty clearly that certain things are more likely to work than others. I won't go through them all right now. But then you have laid out certain things are high impact or moderate. And my general advice to school leaders, to people running youth offending teams, to people doing children's services work, people doing youth, whatever, is I'm not saying that this is a full categorical list of everything that works. But I'm saying, why wouldn't you place more of a bet on the things we've got a bit more of an evidence base for? I'm happy to listen to the answer to that, but why wouldn't you? That's my sort of provocation. Like if someone said you've got to invest £100 and I've got 5 possible options I've assessed and they're really good and I've got 3 I can't tell you either way on, well, I'd probably go for the ones that have got some evidence on, wouldn't I? Then there's some that are low impact, but you might have them for other reasons. So after school programs, I really like after school programs. They're super useful to me as a parent. They're just not a great way of reducing violence. And then you've got some that are interestingly no impact. Street lighting. There's some trials that find that street lighting actually leads to slightly higher violence. We can get into that in discussion if helpful. And then critically, some for which there's no evidence at all. And I mentioned some of these earlier. So if the first position is nothing can be done, and the second position is do something, I think the third of the 4 positions is know what works, like just understand the evidence base before we work out what we're going to do next. And we would see the summary based in the toolkit as key. Now, like all science, I'm talking obviously to a room full of scientists, there's no such book called science that just tells you the answer and it never changes. This will be wrong, right? We will learn new things and it will constantly need to be updated. But it's the best, I think it's the best available evidence that we have at the moment. Okay, we work out what works. Job done, right? I want to go back to Vienna. So Semmelweis works out what needs to happen. He works out that this isn't terribly complicated, guys, and they would have all been guys. We need to wash our hands, okay? It's great that we love all these cloaks that have blood on them, so they show that we're hardcore, but no, we need to actually clean them and wear white ones to prove that they're clean, and we need to start sterilizing and cleaning our equipment. Not a big deal, okay? Let's get going. And so sure enough, the mortality rate, as I said, falls from 1 in 10 to 1 in 100. Now, Semmelweis is pretty excited about this. He decides to go off to spread the news. So he goes to another hospital over in Budapest, and he says, look, let's try this here. We can do the same thing. And sure enough, the same thing happens. The mortality rate falls dramatically to a much lower level, just from people washing their hands, cleaning the equipment, and cleaning their clothes. While Semmelweis is away, what do you think happens to the hospital in Vienna? Presumably they keep going, right? And probably they tell everyone else about that amazing achievement because they're so proud of it. And probably everyone else starts to copy. And the number of women dying from giving birth falls dramatically. And that is the story of the human race. Not at all what happens. Well, Semmelweis is away, and I do think the genders here are not insignificant. The male doctors decide to stop doing it. They stop washing their hands. They stop washing the equipment and they stop washing their clothes. Why? Well, and I'm really not trying to be too sympathetic to them when I say why. It hurt their hands. Like there was not like proper, like good sterilizing stuff. It was quite coarse on their hands, so they didn't like it. I think it hurt their egos. Semmelweis has said the reason that people are dying is because of us. We are carrying somehow disease. This is before germs are identified. We are the cause of this. And I don't think they liked that idea. So they stopped doing it. And the death rate went from 1 in 100 back to 1 in 10. It took 50 years for the behavior of doctors to properly change. Thousands upon thousands of women died. Thousands upon thousands of families, children, lost a parent. Thousands upon thousands of families were broken because of being just absolutely staggering, and yet highly credible that it would occur. It cannot be enough to just work out what works and to assume that through human behavior, people will just move towards stuff that's likely to work. It took me 15 years to work out that it's probably to my advantage to start running regularly, to actually start running regularly. And the only person I had to influence was literally me. I was already convinced of it. And it took me 15 years to put it in practice. We would be ludicrously naive to think that if we produce a nice sort of slide with a load of evidence on it, that somehow is going to change things. So as I sort of come to the last section of this, I want to talk about how do we actually make change happen? Like, how do we turn evidence from being something that exists to change in practice in the real world? So what the final stage, we go from nothing can be done to do something, to know what works. The final stage is actually getting the right stuff done. And I'm going to go through this at pace, but happy to go into it in Q&A. I think that my sort of wrestling take on this, but I'm very happy to sort of iterate it as people sort of have ideas on it, is I think there's probably 4 stages that we need to get right to this. The first is, and this is where it gets a little bit sort of less sort of full of stories, but I think it's sort of practically useful. Like, firstly, who are the delivery organisations who actually work and can support the children that we're talking about? Who actually are they? I've therefore called it knife crime, which is what the government uses, but I'm really interested in trying to reduce violence. I don't really mind, whether it's with a knife or whatever, or with a fist. Or first of all, who are the delivery organisations? Secondly, understand what works, which we've talked about, and also for whom. So not just what works, but for whom. Change the practice of those organisations, and then reform the system to make it easier for those organisations to do it. If you're like, he said a load of words, I didn't quite follow it, don't worry. I'm just going to go through that a bit more, just make grounding it. So let's just be practical here. So I think the first thing that I don't think historically the UK government has been very good at doing is being clear who are the delivery organisations here that matter. And I think there's really 7. And I had this slide earlier. I think there's 7 sectors that you've got to actually be really able to change the practice of: policing, the youth sector, health, particularly mental health, youth justice, particularly youth offending teams, education, particularly alternative provision, which is schools for children who've been permanently excluded, children's services, particularly the bit called extra familial harm, which has often been heavily defunded, where children go if they're suffering harm not from their parents, but from outside of the family. And then the local neighbourhood, which is a rather sort of quaint way of us saying someone needs to sometimes pull all that together. So first we identify who delivers. Again, happy to come back to the Q&A. I think there's sometimes an obsession with saying everything needs to be joined up. If only everything would be joined up, the whole problem would be solved. I'm pro things being joined up, but it feels like we have to be a bit more specific. Like, what exactly do you want to be joined up with what? Sometimes everything must be joined up. It's like a minister's way of saying, I don't really understand any of the content here, but everyone's sort of told me everything needs to be joined up, so everything needs to be joined up. I don't really want everyone in meetings all the time. Some of this is these different sectors just need to do the right thing better. And sometimes they need to join up. But first of all, who are the delivery organisations? Then, secondly, what should they be doing? Like, what actually works? So we looked at this list of things. We should be able to. I'll come back to that. Let me skip this through. Apologies. We should be able to not just get clear on what works at a sort of big level, but actually to change the practice. This is where I was trying to get to. Which of those interventions on your nice sort of Which Magazine's thing, John, which of them actually apply to which sector? Because if I'm saying, look, hotspots policing, which is policing just knowing where violence tends to happen and being regularly present in the right places, is actually a good idea. Not much point me telling that to a head teacher, because they're not going to do hotspot policing. Or me saying that actually in the UK, ramping up stop and search has almost no impact on levels of violence. Again, pretty pointless me telling that to a youth worker who's not going to be doing stop and search. So how do we actually segment up this information and give it to the right people? So there's a cut, for example, for policing, but we would also do a cut for education and say, look, this is the stuff that matters to education. So I'm thinking about education, the sort of thing you start to see is it's targeted mentoring support that's needed not generic assemblies that make a difference. So first of all, who are the delivery organizations? What is it that works? How do you then segment that for each of the groups? And then you've got to, there's nothing that beats foot leather. Like my experience of people who come up with, I've changed the world through this idea, is if it's actually worked, there's somewhere been a load of people going out over a number of years, winning hearts and minds and getting things actually changed. Like the idea that you can just do some podcasts and do some tweets and the world changes is ridiculous. But we've got to actually go out and work with people over a long period of time. And I'm really committed to spending Youth Endowment Funds funding, try and, if we're going to fail, let's fail doing that. Let's get out and really change what people do. But there's a final bit, and then I come to a close, that you not just go out and get clear what needs to change in each sector. We need to really track to what extent are we changing practice. So this is a survey that we've done recently of a load of the school teachers. You saw a cut of this data in a version earlier. We can track quite easily what is going on in our schools and to what extent are they delivering the green stuff and to what extent are they delivering the red stuff. And we can track this every single year and we can see whether it moves or not, which gives us an ability to tell whether the fund is actually making it. And we might not make much of a difference to start with, and then we have to change how we do it. But is practice actually moving towards the stuff that's likely to help children and away from the stuff that's less likely to? But there's a final thing that's critical. If you're a head teacher or a yacht manager, and I say to you, look, here's the stuff that works, why don't you get on and do it? Probably say it a bit more charming than that. But there's a really obvious response, which is probably, I would love to do that stuff, but the system won't let me do it. So we can't be naive about this. How does the system need to change to make it easier to do the stuff that works? So the final step of the process, identify the delivery organizations, understand what works, change the practice. We need to reform the system to make the changes easier. And so we need to be really clear. And this is my slide experience when people talk about reforming the system is they've got it as a slogan, but they struggle to put it into practical practice. It's like, what do you want? The system reformed. What does it mean? Now, I'm like, okay, what do we actually mean? I think we've got to be clear what we mean by the system. And I think for me, it's inspection, regulation, funding, rules, and the amount of funding and guidance. Like what exactly is wrong in the inspection, the regulation, the funding rules, and the guidance that makes it hard for someone to do the stuff that works? And let's be specific. Like what specifically needs to change? Let me give you, and so the first thing is you have to map it, and this is dull, but you've got to do it. So if you take those sectors, so I've just pulled out some of them, probably laid out as a pizza slice here. But if you take policing, and you know that the people who do the delivery are the police forces and particularly senior officers can change practice, you've got to be able to work out this is the inspectorate, this is the person who organisation sets the funding, and this is where the guidance comes from. If we're serious about education, most people will probably get this one quicker. This is the regulation and the funding and the guidance. Here's the inspectorate. So we've got to be really clear. And then we've got to work out in what ways should those change. And so what the YF is doing at present is publishing what specifically should change in practice. So I'll give you one example to close. So Ofsted at the moment is consulting on its new inspection framework. It includes a commitment to inspect what schools are doing to prevent sexual violence between peers. It's a really good thing to include. It doesn't include non-sexual violence. That's just a bit foolish. And so we could change the system. But we have to get to that level of granularity to change things. What I hope you can hear as I come to a real close is I am convinced that the level of violence that we've got doesn't have to be where it is. And I'm convinced we can bring it down. And I'm absolutely convinced that the heart of that is understanding the lives of children. And I think the best way to understand the lives of children is to understand what happens when we change things for them. Does it make things better or does it make things worse? And I'm very keen to make them better rather than make them worse. I'll close there.
So there's no silver bullet. And it takes, I mean, the message summary, no silver bullet. It's a hard problem, as many problems are, and things take time. Okay, on that great talk, Jon, I don't want to talk, I want to get questions in. So this is an opportunity for you all, I've got to stand here anyway, it's you all to ask questions. And we have a mic somewhere. That's Neil, by the way, my colleague Neil, who's going to offer the mic to anyone who wants to ask questions. So over to you. So Ben, Ben, and then Arnab, and then Leah, and then Nandini, and then Carol. So we'll take that.
Thanks, John. That was an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. It was very, very good. So I was just wondering about some of the interventions. You had this toolkit, which was super interesting and intuitive. I was wondering, so the high impact, the medium, and so on, is this sort of a permanent change, or is it like a temporary change? And for some of the children that are tracked, are they tracked through their lifetime, sort of, intervals of 5 years and 10 years and things like that? Or is it sort of a snapshot in time at one point and then a snapshot at another point in time and just taking the difference? I was just curious about some of those because, for example, some of them, they may be more costly up front, but they may have permanent long-term impacts that go over the lifetime of that individual. Whereas maybe some of the other ones have like a short-term effect, but then once they become an adult and that program is removed, like the after-school club, maybe that effect diminishes or something. I'm just curious about how that sort of checks out.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that one? Or?
How, Neil, should we do it in groups? Groups of 3, okay.
Blimey, okay, I'm going to get a pencil.
So we'll take.
Fascinating stuff. Really, very excited about this. A couple of questions, which sort of you got to, but I just want to hear a bit more from you. At the National Institute, we place a great deal of emphasis not only on policy options, but on costing these policy options fully, right? So just interested in your thoughts on that. And therefore, what also matters is what should we do less? If we want to do something more, what should we do less? And in terms of cost, both the financial and the ethical, potentially. And so that's my question, number one. Number two is you mentioned what extent are we delivering? But you're also talking about scaling this up, right? So we do not quite know what the outcomes would be based on the experiments that we have done, right? So how should we address that? Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm interested on the fact that violence and crimes in general in the UK and other countries are committed by men. Can you confirm that it's the same thing for knife crime and what you're working on? And is this something that you include in your action plan in any way, or is it something that you can target more and to make it more efficient, or how do you address that in general?
Yeah. Great. What brilliant questions. And
oh,
super. What brilliant questions and fantastically difficult ones. I'd want to take them to the order which they were are. To what extent are these changes permanent changes, but rather than temporary changes? Is with one of the evaluation. One of the challenges of evaluation is that the longer you follow for, A, the more expensive it is, and B, how long it waits to be able to do something. And so one of the sort of burdens of my life is saying to politicians, great, you're going to do that thing. Let us step at the evaluation so we can tell you if it works or not. Cool, that sounds good, John. Let's do that. What do we need to do? Well, first of all, could you delay the policy for 9 months when we set the what? So their desire to get on is definitely, which I think represents general democratic desire for things to happen, makes it a challenge to do really long-term longitudinal analysis that is based on a proper control group. So there obviously are longitudinal studies, but they don't tend to have a randomization built into them. Now, I promise we're going to build more into your answer. One thing that we're able to do, which I'm really pleased about, is the way in which governments reform data sharing means that we can track all of our studies for the very long term. So anything the YEF is funding, you can ask me, what was the impact after 3 years? What was the impact after 5 years? What was the impact after 10 years? And I can answer you in 3 years, in 10, 5 years, in 7 years, 10 years. So we will be able to actually address that problem in the long run. What we tend to know, therefore, is what is an effective intervention within the pace of about 2 or 3 years. Like, to what extent does violence fall with this intervention with people who went on it compared to who didn't? Now, obviously, those crimes committed are permanently not committed. You just don't know whether there might be something that happens. It'd be a bit odd, but something that happens to catch up the crime later. And it would be good to sort of know that effect. The slight corollary of sometimes of this is, so there's a program on that list called Focus Deterrence, which is something that was done in Glasgow, Malmo, Chicago. Some of the states worked in all places that ended rhyme with O, which is sort of, we're funding a lot of it at the moment. And the program, one of the critiques I heard someone say of it is, yeah, but John, once you stop funding the program, the effect on the neighbourhood goes away and the violence comes back. And I'm like, don't stop funding the program. Like, I feel the criticism is odd. Like, it's a bit like someone said, oh, I see you're funding a primary school. You do know once we close the primary school, children in the area won't learn to read anymore. I'm like, yeah, don't close the primary school, keep it open. And so there's very few programs that you can find that I would be confident to say, run this in Plymouth. That's where I'm from originally. Run this in Plymouth 3 years and never run any crime intervention programs again. That wasn't your observation, but I sometimes find it a sort of, it does intellectually odd position that people get themselves in. Then on the costings, I think I'd say there's three main weaknesses in the evidence, right? So one is just there's not enough of it, hence me having to say, we don't even know some of these things that we're spending millions of pounds on were. The second is, I would like to do the longitudinal effect. We are solving that, but it will take some time. The third is trying to do the cost analysis. So for each of the systematic reviews that you've got here, we've got an estimate of the cost. So you can do, the difficulty is, in practice, say you've got like 75 different evaluations behind the mentoring strand, and we could tell you the average effect. In practice, the cost of those vary quite a lot. And it's quite hard to work out to what extent cost is a driver of the effectiveness. And it probably slightly depends on things that are, how good was the organization, how well were the networks set up, what country did it happen in? And so I'm always a little wary. For the Treasury, we're always doing like cost analysis stuff. I sometimes wonder how valuable it actually is, because it does depend a bit on implementation. The point about scaling, I mean, those who sort of know this world, the more you scale up something that works, the less it tends to work. I think there's two things. One is, I'm not sure this is a problem that necessarily gets solved by an intervention delivered by organisation A becoming progressively bigger and bigger and bigger. I think because it tends to require quite a lot of local knowledge to deliver most of these things, or relationships. So it's more about lots and lots of growing numbers of organizations delivering the practice. That doesn't solve the problem, because you still need the fidelity, but it does make it slightly a simpler problem. The ultimate solution is to just keep on doing effectiveness studies to see the impacts. The trouble is, of course, politicians and humans don't really want to wait. We want to get on, but it's a real challenge. I recognise it. The final one was about men rather than women. Men are more likely to commit serious violence than women, significantly so. So most of our work disproportionately is supporting young men or young boys rather than girls from a people we are trying to prevent committing acts of violence. But it's important, as your question suggests, not all violence is obviously committed by men. There is a weird quirk. When you get to less serious levels of violence, this tends to even up. So in the 10,000 sample, we don't find that boys are more likely to commit violence than girls. We are quite puzzled by this. Now, when we look at other measures that have got to that sample, they tend to find a similar thing. But it's really clear when you look at homicide, we look at convictions, it's much more male than female. Now, you could say, well, maybe that's a police bias or some weird thing going on. But homicides are quite hard to hide. And the homicides that are solved, disproportionately men have committed them. So I think it's totally right to say serious violence is predominantly a male problem, as those who commit it. It's also worth saying homicide disproportionately affects men as victims. And that does get sometimes missed, because I think we are thinking about domestic abuse, domestic violence, which obviously disproportionately affects women. That's probably a longer answer than you wanted.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you so much for your insightful discussion. And so my question is, if you put gender, race, living conditions, costs, and regional differences Now, also on the basis of cultural differences and diverse backgrounds, how will the whole experiment or your research will go on?
Yeah.
And what kind of differences in impact will be there?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm almost certainly not the first person to ask you this, but I'm interested in what you said about systems reform. You were talking about reforming organizations so that they could implement particular programs, as you've got up there. But you'll be aware that there's a point of view that says that the way schools, for example, operate it works in such a way that particular pupils are more likely to be alienated and disengaged from school. So we've got high exclusion rates, for example. The move towards very strict disciplinary policies in some school, which the Children's Commission have said impacts negatively on children's mental health. So it's about, what about the normal working of those organizations?
Yeah. Shall I take just those two? Is that right? Because there's quite a lot in those, and I'll try and be quick. Does that work? So on, if we start with race, I mean, I don't think we can talk about violence for long without being serious about race. You know, a black boy in this country is 6 times more likely to be murdered than a white boy. I mean, it's worth almost saying that again. Like, a black boy is 6 times more likely to be murdered than a white boy. I don't think that there's a lot of racial injustice in the criminal justice system. Nothing touches that statistic for me. Like, that is just, there's no worse civil right violation than the loss of your life. And so we have to sort of, wherever you put yourself on the woke, not woke scale, right? You can't be serious about reducing violence if we're not serious about race. It just is obvious statistically. Now, I think it requires us to do a couple of things. So one is, for me personally, and our organization personally, we have a suite of sort of specific commitments around how we recruit the team, how we recruit the leadership, but how we run the trials. So, for example, trying to get subgroup analysis to include race wherever we can. It's not always possible. And so, an interesting quirk is one of the commitments is to try and always make sure we're funding a relatively good proportion of majority Black-led small charities, because they can get missed in evaluations, but their sample size, because they're small, tends to be smaller, which makes it harder to do subgroup analysis to spot. So these things aren't totally sort of without some trade-offs. But we've committed to say, look, a certain portion of our funding will always reach Black and brown children. A certain portion of our funding will always reach Black and brown-led charities. In our evaluations, we're always trying to do subgroup analysis. In our change commitments, we'll always commit to things that are doing stuff about racial disproportionality. And I think this isn't about being woke or not woke. It's just like, I'm serious about the mission. And so we've got to get this stuff right. So I think it's normally important. On the systems reform, I'm really up for the YEF saying unpopular things around how schools organise themselves. We just have to make sure we've got the evidence for it. And I think that the point that someone was making is there's some things I'll say as John and some things I'll say as the YEF. And when I conflate the two, no one should listen to the YEF anymore. And so I think that the evidence around disproportionality of race and exclusions is a complicated one, to pick that specific one. And you know, there's an oddity that, like, the gap between, so if we went back in time 5 years ago, Black pupils were more likely to be permanently excluded than white pupils. That gap has now closed to 0, but there hasn't really been much celebration, and it's slightly odd. And it's almost like those who are non-woke don't want to talk about it, and those who are more woke don't want to mention something got better. And I'm like, something good actually happened here. We should work out what happened. But what's left is a real difference between the Black Caribbean experience and the Black African children experience. And we've got to understand that. And we've got to lean into what the experience is, obviously, and you'll know this stuff very well, but for Gypsy and Traveller children. And I think this stuff is quite complicated for us to just step through really carefully. On like schools that are sort of zero tolerance, we are funding a trial at the moment to try and understand the difference of impact of different methods of behavioural management on resulting levels of exclusion, resulting levels of violence. It's proving really hard because the schools are really unreliable in estimating what they are. So schools who say, well, we're more behaviouralists, when you go and visit them actually aren't. And schools who say, well, actually, we're not that way, when you go visit them sometimes are. And so it's just taking a bit of time to get it right. But I would really like to get to the bottom of it.
Michaela and Joe. So we'll do two at a time, or do you want?
I will. Well, you do what you like. You take charge. Don't listen to me.
We'll do two at a time. So we'll do Michaela and Joe, and then Scarlett and Edward.
This is all absolutely fantastic, very great presentation, lots of measures. But what I was thinking is that when the kids leave school, they go back to the family.
Yeah.
And how can these measures change what happens in the family? Because these kids are coming from, difficult background.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, really great presentation. Loved it. Really, really interesting stuff. My question, just wanted you to unpick a little bit more about how you go from the evidence to action and scale, because I love this. I'm a policy wonk. This looks great. You talked about the sort of, I can't remember the exact term used, but essentially the delivery partners, the delivery elements of the system. And you talked about, shoe leather, going out and speaking to people as being a key part of influencing their actions, and also the wider system. What else works in trying to communicate this to people and trying to influence behaviour change, particularly if that conflicts with what you were talking about, normal ways of working?
Yeah, thank you. So family, I haven't explicitly talked that much about family, but it's not because I don't think it's important. I think that what is the, I'm very much stealing thoughts here from Keir, who we were talking about earlier, Luke. What is the most, in my sort of experience, and obviously summarised brilliantly by them, the key thing that I find to be true in the children I talk to who are vulnerable in all sorts of ways is a sense of not feeling like they matter, and not feeling that there's something that makes people feel like they have that sort of purpose of sort of definite, I am someone who, and I think at the heart of that, and the evidence is very clear on this, is the importance of an adult who says, you do matter, I'm investing it. That's why youth work has become so important. But who are the adults who children predominantly spend their time with? It's their parents. And so when we talk about trusted adult, the most significant trusted adult for the majority of children is their mum or their dad. And for many of the children who we wish things life would be better for, it's because actually their parents weren't able to fulfill that role. And if you were able to change that, you would make a transformational difference to this problem. It's very difficult to address that. To some extent, you end up in a slightly circular loop, because sometimes people say, well, John, it's lovely that you're talking about how to solve these problems, particularly with teens, but why don't we do more work with children at 10? And then someone says, well, why not when they're 7? So someone says, why not when they're 4? No, it really should be when they're 1. No, it really should be in uterus. No, you really should work. What you should do is work with the mother before she has the. Really, you should work with the father. And I'm like, we've just gone back to, so I do sort of come to, we just need to find all the things that work at different points. But definitely, if we can, children's services is a big focus area for us, which obviously is predominantly doing work around the family. The evidence base is really weak. And it's partly the time point you were making about the longitudinal study. So the work you do around the family, often quite hard to prove the link to offending. So I can prove the link to behaviour and the way a child lives out their behaviour, but it's not. So that makes it a bit challenging. But parents are colossal. How do you make change happen? Man, if you could answer that question for me, it would save me a lot of time and effort. I think that the first thing is I just don't think it naturally happens at all. And I think it is more likely not to happen than to happen. So I sort of lead the organisation with a view is we're much more likely to fail at making the change happen than to succeed. And I think that's really important because it requires us to think much harder about it. I think that my bet at the moment is to really go hard on 3 things. So it's to, one, for each, identify the audience really carefully. So a head teachers are really busy. What sort of things are they wrestling? What are they listening with? Let's produce really clear advice for them on what the 5 things they can do are, and then let's repeat it to them and work with them in a suite of different ways over 3 years. And so we're going to fund a load of different levels of intervention, light touch, heavier touch, really heavy touch, and just see which ones move. And then we'll put more money into the ones that do it. And then on the system, win people over. Like policymakers like being liked. Win them over, make the argument, and build a relationship, tell stories. Don't fall into the trap that the evidence is what convinces people to do the evidence-based thing, because it's not.
Wait, Scarlett and Eduardo, we'll be coming towards the end, but we'll have them for sure.
Hi there. So in instances where a child commits violent behavior in a school, and they're at risk of being suspended, obviously we know suspension or exclusion can be terrible for a child when it comes to becoming more violent. But how do you walk the line of protecting the rest of the school and, looking out for the child that's being excluded? And on from that, do you think exclusion needs to be stopped? And do you think there should be something different in place instead of exclusion? So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question on more a comment, but possibly a question on the use of RCTs in this program. I really like the way you laid out the toolkit and the definition of the preventions and the outcomes and so on. Now, very sympathetic to the use of RCT. And but what I find interesting, for example,
I can hear a butt coming here as well. You're building up to it incredibly gently.
I really like the example of the prison awareness program in New Jersey. What I found very interesting is very counterintuitive, right? So it's very why. So my question is, why did that happen? Right?
Yeah.
So why people behaving that way? And I think that should be one of the goals of RCT, to understand why people behave in a particular way. So it's not just about telling whether intervention was or not, which is very important, but it's also understanding people's behavior.
Yeah.
Because if you do that, and I don't understand why do they behave that way, right? So we didn't talk about that. But if you do, maybe that will help you to design better some intervention in the list. And maybe some intervention will say, no, this is completely useless. Because it makes no sense. So, great to do RCTs, but what kind of RCTs are we supporting?
Yeah.
So is it just yes or no?
Yeah.
Or is it something more oriented to understand people's behavior?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eduardo. It's a great question. So let me do them in reverse order. So I think a better RCT than no RCT, but better RCT than worse RCT would be my preference. So I think what I mean by that is an RCT can tell you exactly what Eduardo's got at. It's designed very simply. Half the people drank that water you just drank, John, and half didn't, and all the people who drank the water died within 10 minutes. So you probably should go to hospital, right? But it can't tell me what was in the water that killed me. And so an RCT can tell you the consequence, but it can't tell you the mechanism. And so we will. I don't think there are perfect solutions to this problem, but I think there are some good things that you probably would agree are good things to do. So one is what might be termed a process or an implementation evaluation to actually understand what's being done, how did it work, what do we learn? And we do fund those as standard, as would be talking to the young people, getting their own insights of the experience, talking to practitioners. So we would standardly fund that work. The weakness of it, of course, is it's still opinion, or experience. It's not necessarily right, and it will be affected by obviously the prevailing norms of society as to how people interpret why things have happened to them. But it's better that we do it. We spend government taxpayer money on it, so we believe in it. The best thing I'd like to do more is lots of multiple variations in the RCT, so you can actually pick up which mechanism matters. That just requires a way bigger sample. And a very good thing, really, is that the number of young people who get involved in violence is relatively small. And so it can be quite hard to get those really big samples. But those are the things that we tend to sort of wrestle with. Well confused. The slight sort of, I guess, counterpoint I probably have is, if we're not certain of the why, I think sometimes there's the danger that an organisation that is vested with some degree of authority speaks knowledgeably about the why, because then everyone takes that as the answer, and then everyone bases their research on that assumption. And I kind of think there might be better in people sort of having a multitude of views the why, and then we just test the things they come up with. And hopefully science moves forward by testing a variety of different things. And then we can work out what works and probably guess who was right about the why. But that's a judgment. The question about exclusion, I think it's a really important one. I think it's been long contested about whether exclusions cause violence or not. So most of the public probably have talked to you about it would say they think it do. A lot of teachers think it doesn't. And that's because there's such high correlation, because the type of person who might be excluded in that moment of their life is the type of person in the moment of life who might commit violence. And in some cases, the violence is predating the exclusion rather than the other way around. I think we have now, we're close to publishing pretty strong proof that exclusion does cause an increase in violence. I am pretty cautious about saying, well, therefore QED, we must ban exclusions. I think that would be ethically the wrong thing to do. I think that there have to be moments at which a school can say, we cannot safely look after this child to keep other children safe. But where it would leave me much more is how good are we at getting support to the children who are at risk of doing something that makes exclusion essentially necessary? I think we could be way better at that. I think, and some schools are brilliantly well organised in avoiding the need for exclusion in the first place. And I think we could make massive. And if you kind of sort of, if you survey teachers, we did this very recently. Do you think exclusions are too high? I should point out they're way higher than they've been for about 3 years. Do you think exclusions are too high? It's a rhetorical question. What percentage of teachers do you think they are presently too high? 1%. So 1% of teachers think exclusions are presently too high. So I think you've got to recognise you're not going to take teachers with you, but if you ask teachers, would you like us to do more to prevent the sort of things that happen that lead to exclusions, they're totally with you. And so that's, to me, the space that we should get into rather than a fight that, and we should get way more better at the space of what happens post an exclusion. Because what I think happens is there's some really, really brilliant places, alternative provision places, and a lot of very bad provision. And a lot of it isn't even inspected. And I think that that is sort of irresponsible. There's some reasons for it, but broadly irresponsible.
I'm going to give one, there's drinks next door, and we're going to soon go there, not just here. I want to give Philip the last question, if I might. So, listen, did somebody ask the question? Oh, Philip, and then Robin will have the last one.
Hi, sorry. Couple of quick questions. So you've got stop and search there listed under moderate impact, accepted low in the UK. Can you explain why you think it's low in the UK? And second, slightly cheeky question, if you had to identify another area of the CJS where you thought improving the evidence base could bring big benefits in terms of improved utilisation of resources, better decision making, etc., what would it be?
Yeah. Oh, so many thoughts. Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
I think so. My question is around like the measure the impact of violence. So violence has to be reported.
Yes.
And what happens if it's less likely to be reported? So it's like in Scotland, I know it's not included in travel, the under 25 guideline is, and there's a lot of people that you feel there's no point going to the police is underfunded, Edinburgh Police Force is underfunded, I have friends in the police force. And it is a bit of like a lot of violence committed against under 25s. It's committed by people who are under 25.
Yeah.
I haven't actually seen numbers, my general idea is that. But how do you like include that in your impact if people are just not reporting it?
Yeah. Yeah. So let me take them in reverse order again. I'm going to sound a little bit Panglossian. I'm going to be like, it should be all right. So the advantage of being able to compare the control group with the non-control is that sort of issue should be true of both. And so you should be able to pick it up. So if we genuinely find a variance, it means it's like highly likely to be there. But it's not that you're not onto something, because I'm going to sort of lose people a bit, so apologies. But let's say the program does make a difference, but it's quite a small difference. And that variance is made even smaller because there's consistent underreporting in both groups. We might not find an impact that actually is there because there's significant underreporting. Now, some of that is mitigated by sometimes we use other outcomes. So we measure sort of self-assessment of children and young people saying, but what behaviours have they done? I don't love that method, partly because I don't think it's nearly as reliable, but it has much less of that issue for picking up the effect. It's a brilliant question, but it's a much wider problem, as you know, colleagues in the criminal justice system will know. We have a huge amount of violence that's underreported. Then the criminal justice questions, stop and search. It's back to Eduardo's point. We don't really know why stop. There've been 3 evaluations of stop and search in the UK. I should point out what they test isn't turning it off and turning it on. What they test is ramping it up. So in each case, stop and search was ramped up in certain areas and not in other areas. And in 2 of the cases, a small effect was found, and in 1 of the cases, no effect was found. Now, why would that be when in the US evaluations, it was slightly more numerous, you find a bigger effect? I suspect I could get sort of how many criminologists would I need in the room to get 10 different opinions? 1? I don't know. Like I don't personally know what's going on. I think that the main thing I take from it though is we talk way too much about stop and search. Like for an issue that has really very little effect in the evaluation evidence, and we're never going to get rid of it because what's the alternative? To get rid of stop and search, what are the police meant to do? Arrest everyone? Like, so it feels like we're spending too long on the topic. I'm not saying we should spend no time on it. There are serious issues to talk about, but there's way more important things to do, I think, to try and bring down violence. And then where would I go for more evidence? I'd love to know more about deferred prosecution. So where a person is arrested and they're not charged, but a decision is made to defer the prosecution. So it's not dismissed, it's not a no further action. There's a decision to come back and charge. I think there's evidence for the adults that has quite a significant effect, but it hasn't been trialed properly for children. I'd like to close that gap. The prison estate is, I mean, the youth offending institutions in this country are a disgrace. And I'm not trying to blame the people running them particularly. I think they're very hard to do, but it's a disaster. And we urgently need evidence about how to turn them around. Very small sample size, quite hard to do. I'll probably stop there.